He walked through the front door of their home with another woman's perfume on his collar and that woman on his arm. Not sneaking, not ashamed, he announced it. Kang Min-jae, the most feared crime boss in Seoul, stood in the marble foyer of the Han River mansion and told his wife of 9 years that Yoon Seo-rin would be moving into the suite that had once belonged to Nia's late mother. He said it the way a man announces a business decision, calm, final, expecting no argument. Then he set the divorce papers on the dining table like they were nothing more than a utility bill. He had already decided how this would end. He was wrong. If someone treated you that way, walked into your home, your life, everything you built, and expected you to simply disappear, what would you do? Because Nia Okoye didn't scream. She didn't beg. What she did next changed everything. Stay with this story until the end. If you're watching from Chicago, Seoul, Lagos, London, or anywhere in between, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because the stories on this channel don't end where you expect them to. The night it happened, Nia was in the study reviewing quarterly reports for the Kang Group's Singapore holdings when she heard the front door open. She registered the sound the way she registered most things these days, at a distance, like it was happening to someone else. 9 years of marriage to Min-jae had trained her to hold herself slightly apart from her own life. It was the only way to survive it. She heard his voice first, low, unhurried, the voice he used when he'd already won something. Then she heard another voice, a woman's, light and performative, the kind of voice that practiced its own sound. Nia set down her pen. She didn't move yet. She waited, because she'd learned that waiting revealed more than rushing. The heels came first. Sharp, deliberate clicks on the marble floor of the entryway. Then Min-jae's footsteps behind them, which meant he was letting her lead. That alone told Nia everything she needed to know about who this woman was to him. She pushed back from the desk and walked to the doorway of the study. From there she could see the full width of the main hall. The arched ceilings Min-jae had commissioned, the antique console table she'd sourced herself from a dealer in Incheon, the bronze light fixtures she'd argued with the architect about for 3 weeks. She had built every inch of this house into a home. She had forgotten, somewhere in those 9 years, that it was only ever his name on the original deed. Yoon Seo-rin was younger than Nia had imagined. Late 20s, maybe. A sharp, angular face with the kind of expensive bone structure that photographed well. She wore a cream blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carried herself with the particular confidence of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was something special. Maybe she was. Nia did. She had no feelings about her yet. What she had feelings about was Min-jae's face. He saw Nia standing in the doorway, and he didn't flinch, didn't pause, didn't have the decency to show a single crack of discomfort. He just looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for years, assessing, measuring, already certain of the outcome before the conversation started. "You're still up," he said. "Working," Nia said. He nodded, like that confirmed something for him. Then he put his hand on the small of Seo-rin's back. Not possessively, just casually, the gesture of a man who had already decided this was normal, and said, "This is Yoon Seo-rin. She'll be staying here." Nia looked at Seo-rin. Seo-rin looked back with an expression that wasn't quite apologetic and wasn't quite triumphant. It was something in between, the look of a woman who had told herself a story in which she was not the villain and mostly believed it. "Staying where?" Nia said. Not a question, a request for specificity. "The East Wing Suite," Min-jae said. "Your mother's old rooms." The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Nia felt something move through her chest that she could not name. It wasn't rage exactly, and it wasn't grief. It was more like the moment a bone breaks, the sound before the pain. Her mother had died in that suite. Not in the room itself, in a hospital, but she had spent her last 18 months in those rooms while Nia cared for her, and Min-jae traveled, and the empire kept expanding, and life kept demanding more than either of them could reasonably give. Nia had kept those rooms exactly as her mother left them, not as a shrine, just because she hadn't been ready. Min-jae knew that. He knew it, and he chose it anyway. "I see," Nia said. "There's something else." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the console table between them. Her console table, her antique, her choice. I had the lawyers prepare this. Better to handle it cleanly. Nia didn't move toward it. What is it? Divorce papers. He said it without ceremony, without anything. It's straightforward. You'll be taken care of. You won't have any financial difficulty. Seorin had gone very still beside him. Even she, Nia thought, hadn't expected this much. Even she had imagined there would be more. More conversation, more time, more of a transition. But Min Jae had never been interested in transitions. He was interested in outcomes. Nia walked to the console table. She picked up the document and opened it. She actually read, the first several pages. Slowly enough that Min Jae shifted his weight once, which was as close as he came to showing impatience. Seorin looked at the ceiling. The papers were thorough. His lawyers were good. They always had been. The settlement terms were structured to appear generous. A lump sum, a monthly allowance, the apartment in Mapo she'd never lived in, while carefully ensuring that none of the Kong Group's primary holdings were touched. She was being bought out of her own life. Neatly. Efficiently. With the particular cruelty of people who had thought of everything. Almost everything. Nia turned to the last page. She found the signature line. Above it, in small print, was a line reading, "By signing below, the undersigned acknowledges receipt of these documents and does not waive any rights to response or legal counsel." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she found a pen in the inside pocket of her cardigan. She always had one, old habit from her accounting days in Chicago, back when she was just Nia Okoye and not the Mafia Boss's wife. And she signed her name on that line, not the settlement line, not the consent line, the receipt line, the one that said she had been given the papers and nothing more. She folded the documents back up and set them on the table. "You need to call your lawyers tomorrow," she said. "There are some questions they'll want to ask you." Min Jae frowned, just slightly. "What questions?" "About the East Wing," Nia looked at Seorin. "About the mansion, about several of the holding companies in the portfolio." She paused. "Before anyone moves into my mother's rooms, there are some structural legal matters that need clarification." "What are you talking about?" he said, and his voice had changed, just slightly, the way weather changes before a storm. A drop in temperature that most people wouldn't notice. Nia noticed it. She'd been noticing it for 9 years. "Call your lawyers," she said again. "I'll be available to discuss it after they've reviewed the trust documents." She picked up the divorce papers. "I'll take these with me tonight, for my own counsel to review." Min Jae stared at her. In 22 years of knowing this man, 9. Married, but she'd known him before, known him when he was still climbing. She had never seen him genuinely caught off guard. She saw it now, just for a moment. A flicker. He covered it quickly, the way he covered everything quickly, but she had seen it and she filed it away. "Nia," he said, and his voice was different again, softer. The voice he used when he wanted something and had decided softness was the faster route. "Don't make this complicated. You've always understood how things work. This doesn't have to be—" "Minji," she said his name quietly. "Call your lawyers." She walked back to the study. She closed the door behind her. She stood with her back against it for approximately 30 seconds, breathing. Her hands were not quite steady. That was allowed. The hands could shake as long as the voice didn't. On the desk, her phone showed 3 missed calls from Do Hyun, Chairman Park. Do Hyun, who was in Seoul this week negotiating the alliance terms, who had called 3 times in the last 2 hours about documents she'd sent him that afternoon. Documents she had sent deliberately. Documents whose contents, she suspected, had caused the specific look on Park Do Hyun's face when he'd read them. The look of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about a deal. She picked up the phone and called him back. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Okoye." His Korean was formal but not cold. Chairman Park was many things, but he was never cold. "I've been going through what you sent me. And—" a pause. "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "The Jeju Island properties listed in Min Jae's portfolio presentation," he said. "The Busan Warehouse Network. The 4 shell companies connected to the Singapore routing account." He stopped. "Ms. Okoye, does Min Jae actually control those assets?" Nia sat down in her chair. Outside the study door, she could hear Min Jae's voice and Seorin's voice, lower now, quieter, the sound of people recalibrating. "That," Nia said carefully, Is an excellent question, Chairman Park. I think we should meet tomorrow to discuss it. Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him thinking, could practically hear the architecture of his thoughts rearranging. I'll clear my morning, he said. Thank you. She set the phone down. She swiveled in her chair and looked at the filing cabinet in the corner, the one she'd brought from Chicago, the one Min-jae had always found slightly ridiculous in a house this expensive, the one he'd never thought to look inside because he'd never imagined that the documents most dangerous to him would be kept in plain sight in a second-hand cabinet his wife had carried across an ocean. The trust had been her father's idea, structured before his death, before she even married Min-jae. James Okoye had spent his life watching powerful men mistake the vehicles of their power for the power itself. He had known men like Min-jae, not criminals, but the same species of certainty, the same architecture of ego. And he had known that his daughter was brilliant, and that brilliant women married to powerful men often found their own intelligence weaponized against them. So he'd done what he could. He'd built something she could stand on when the ground beneath her gave way. She had never imagined she'd need it, even after the coldness set in, after the years of distance and silence and the slowly dawning understanding that Min-jae did not see her as a partner, but as an asset. She had told herself it would change. She told herself she was too old for easy answers and too invested to leave. She told herself a lot of things. She was done telling herself things. She opened the filing cabinet. Third drawer. The folder labeled, in her father's handwriting, simply J.O. Holdings. Secondary Trust Instruments. She pulled it out and set it on the desk. Thick, dense. The kind of document that requires 3 lawyers and 2 accountants to fully understand, which was precisely why it had sat undisturbed for 9 years. In the morning, she would take this to her attorney. In the morning, she would meet with Park Do-hyun and begin the process of clarification. In the morning, the full picture would start to become visible to the people who needed to see it. Tonight, she just needed to get through tonight. She opened the folder. She started to read. Outside the study door, the house had gone quiet. Whatever conversation Min-jae and Seo-rin were having had either concluded or moved elsewhere. Nia didn't go to check. She let them have the hallways and the kitchen and the east wing and whatever else they thought they were taking. She had the study and the cabinet and the folder and the pen in her cardigan pocket. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. Around 2 in the morning, she stopped reading and looked up at the window. The Han River was black and still below, the city lights catching on its surface in broken patterns. She had loved this view for 9 years. She had thought it belonged to her marriage. She was realizing, slowly, that it had only ever belonged to her. She thought about her mother. She thought about the East Wing rooms and who would be sleeping in them tonight. And she let herself feel that, felt it fully, the grief of it, the specific wrongness of it. And then she set it aside. Not buried, set aside. There was a difference. Buried things rotted. Set aside things waited. She thought about the morning meeting with Park Do-hyun, about his careful voice on the phone, about the particular quality of his silence when he understood something. She had met him 6 months ago at a trade conference, and she had known immediately that he was different. Not because he was kind, though he was, but because he saw her. Not as Min-jae's wife, not as an accessory to an empire, as someone doing something, as someone who mattered in her own right. She hadn't known what to do with that at first. She'd had to relearn how to be seen. She thought about Min-jae's face in the hallway, the flicker. She thought about her father's handwriting on the folder cover. J.O. Holdings. James Okoye, who had worked 60-hour weeks in a Chicago accounting firm and built something solid and passed it to his daughter, not as an inheritance but as a weapon, though he'd never called it that. He'd called it options. Every woman needs options, he used to say, sitting across from her at his kitchen table when she was 15, teaching her to read a balance sheet. Especially the ones who are smart enough to have none taken from them. She hadn't listened well enough. She'd let 9 years pass without activating what he'd given her. But she was listening now. She closed the folder. She turned off the desk lamp. She sat for a moment in the dark with the river below her and the house around her and the full weight of what she was about to do pressing against her chest, and she breathed through it. Tomorrow, everything would start to change. She didn't know the full shape of what was coming. She knew her own name. She knew her father's trust documents. She knew that Min-jae had built his empire on ground he had never actually surveyed. That was enough to begin. Park Do-hyun was already at the cafe when Nia arrived. He had chosen a table near the back wall. Not a corner, which would have looked like concealment, but not near the windows either, which would have looked like performance. A table that said, "I am here to work." She noticed that about him. He made small decisions well. He stood when she walked in. Not out of ceremony, just because it was the decent thing to do, and he was a man who did the decent thing without making a production of it. He was taller than she remembered from the conference. Or maybe she'd been looking at him sideways then, measuring him against Min-jae, against every powerful man she'd learned to manage from a careful distance. "Miss Okoye." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for clearing your morning." She sat. She'd brought the folder. Not the full trust documents, just the summary instruments, the ones that told the story without requiring a law degree to follow. She set it on the table between them. "Before we start, I want to be clear about something." He waited. He was good at waiting. She'd noticed that too. "I'm not here to ask for your help," she said. "I'm here because the documents I sent you last night affect your negotiations with the Kong Group, and you have a right to accurate information before you commit to anything. What you do with that information is your business." Do-hyun looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, more like a recalibration. The look of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and was adjusting to another. "That's a very precise way to start a meeting," he said. "I've learned to be precise." He nodded once. "Then let me be precise as well." He opened his own folder. She saw he'd printed her documents, annotated them in red, the handwriting small and controlled. 3 of the 4 assets Min-jae presented as primary collateral in the alliance structure appear to be held not by the Kang Group directly, but by a trust entity I couldn't find registered under any Kang corporate umbrella. The trust reference number comes up attached to a different surname entirely. He looked at her. "Okoye." "Yes." "Your father." "Yes." The cafe was quiet around them. A Tuesday morning, early enough that the commuter rush had thinned. Somewhere behind the counter, a machine hissed steam. Do-hyun folded his hands on the table. His hands were steady. She noticed that too. She was noticing too many things about this man, and she told herself it was just the stress of the situation making her hyper-aware of everything. "How long has he not known?" Do-hyun said. It wasn't quite a question. "He's always known the trust existed," Nia said carefully. "He believed he understood the scope of it. He didn't read the secondary instruments." Men like Min-jae rarely read what they've already decided they understand. She looked at him. "You know men like Min-jae." "I've done business adjacent to men like Min-jae for 20 years, he said. "I know exactly what they see when they look at someone like you. They see loyalty and competence, and they call it devotion. They never think to call it leverage." Something moved through her chest. Not warmth. She wasn't ready for warmth. Something more like recognition. The particular relief of being correctly identified. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "When this comes out, and it will come out, the Alliance Review will force it into the open. It will be chaotic. For the syndicate, for the people who depend on Min-jae's organization for their livelihoods, for the political figures who've benefited from his protection. I'm not doing this to burn everything down." She paused. "But it may burn anyway. I need to know that you've thought about that." Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man gathering a convincing answer. The silence of a man who had already thought about it and was deciding how honestly to respond. "I have thought about it," he said. "I've thought about it since 2 in the morning, when I finished reading your documents the first time." He met her eyes. "What you're describing isn't destruction, Ms. Okoye. It's correction. The people who built their livelihoods on Min-jae's organization built them on frameworks your father's trust made possible. Those frameworks will still exist. They'll just have the right name on them." She picked up her coffee. Her hands were steadier than they'd been last night. 8 hours of sleep. Not good sleep, but sleep. And the simple physical act of sitting across from someone who was engaging with the reality of her situation, rather than trying to manage her out of it, had done something to her equilibrium. She felt less like she was standing at the edge of something, more like she was already in motion. "I'm meeting with my attorney at 11, she said. "I expect Min-jae will have called his lawyers by now. Things will start moving quickly." "I'll instruct my team to pause the alliance documentation pending clarification," Do-hyun said. "I'll frame it as due diligence. That will buy you some time without tipping Min-jae's hand about how much I know. She started to say thank you, then stopped herself. She didn't want to make this into something it wasn't. I appreciate that. It's also genuinely in my interest, he said. I don't commit capital to deals built on misrepresentation. This protects me as much as it helps you. He paused. I want you to know that because I don't want you to feel indebted to me. That would be... He searched for the word. Structurally wrong. She looked at him. Structurally wrong. She almost smiled. She hadn't almost smiled in so long, the muscles for it felt uncertain. Structurally wrong, she repeated. It would create an imbalance, he said, and his expression had something in it now. Very slight, very controlled, but something human and almost wry. And I find I would rather not have an imbalance with you. She picked up the folder. I need to go. I know. He stood again when she rose. Miss Okoye, for what it's worth. He stopped. Go ahead. Whatever he told you about what you were to him. Whatever version of events he's constructed to make himself the reasonable party in this. He held her gaze. I've spent approximately 14 hours with your documentation and I can see what you built. What you actually built. Numbers and structure and risk management. The architecture of the whole legitimate side of his empire. It's visible in the documents if you know how to look. He paused. He doesn't know how to look. That was his fundamental mistake. She left without answering, not because she had nothing to say, because she didn't trust what would come out if she opened her mouth right then, standing in a Tuesday morning cafe with the Han River 3 blocks away and 9 years of her life in a folder under her arm. She walked to her car. She sat in it for 2 minutes without starting the engine. Then she started the engine and drove to her attorney's office. Her attorney was a woman named Cho Yeon-hee, who had been practicing family and corporate law for 30 years and had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed complexity. She read through the trust summary instruments in 12 minutes flat. Then she went back and read 3 specific sections a second time. You understand, Cho said without looking up, that this is not a standard marital asset dispute. I know. The trust predates the marriage by 2 years. Your father structured it before Min-jae had any claim to your financial life. That matters enormously. She set the papers down. Does Min-jae's legal team know the full scope of what the trust covers? They know the trust exists. They've seen the primary instruments, not the secondary. Cho looked at her. He never asked to see the secondary instruments? No. In 9 years? No. Cho made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Arrogance, she said, is the single greatest gift a client's opponent can have. She picked up a pen. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Nia listened. She asked 3 questions. Cho answered all 3 with the brisk, no-ceremony clarity of a woman who had watched too many people lose too much to bother with softening what needed to be said straight. By the time Nia left the office, it was past noon. Her phone had 7 missed calls. 2 from Min-jae's personal number. 3 from a number she recognized as belonging to one of his senior lieutenants, a man named Baek Sung-il, who ran the legitimate side of operations and who had always treated Nia with a guarded, watchful respect that she had never fully understood until now. 1 from her sister in Chicago. 1 from a number she didn't recognize. She called the unknown number back. Ms. Okoye. A man's voice, formal, slightly clipped. My name is Han Jae-won. I'm senior counsel for the Kong Group. I believe we need to meet. I agree, she said. Have your client present. A pause. That might be non-negotiable, she said. If you want to talk about the trust, Min-jae needs to be in the room. I won't discuss it with intermediaries. Another pause. Longer. She could hear the lawyer recalibrating. Tomorrow morning, he said finally. 9 o'clock. Our offices. Send me the address. She hung up. She sat in her car in the parking garage beneath Cho's building and called Min-jae's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She called again. This time he picked up on the second ring. You talked to your lawyers, she said. Nia. His voice was different from last night, tighter. The composure was still there, but it was effortful now. She could hear the effort underneath it. I need you to come to the house. I'm not coming to the house. We need to talk about this in person, without lawyers, without Min-jae. I spoke to my attorney this morning. Your lawyers called me. We have a meeting set for tomorrow. What specifically do you want to talk about right now? On this call? A silence. She heard him breathe. Just once, controlled. He was in a room alone, she could tell. No ambient noise, no seorin, just the particular silence of a man who had sent everyone away so he could make this call. The East Wing, he said finally. The mansion. Yes. You told me there were legal complications. There are. Nia. His voice dropped. Not soft. He wasn't trying for soft anymore. Something more stripped down. Is the house in the trust? She waited just long enough that he would feel the weight. Your lawyers will explain it tomorrow. Is the house in the trust? Harder this time. An edge she hadn't heard from him in years, the one beneath the composure, the one that reminded her of who he actually was and what he was actually capable of. She felt it move through her. Not quite fear, but the memory of fear, the body's archive. Yes, she said. The primary residence and the East Wing and the land it sits on. She paused. Among other things. The silence on his end was total. Absolute. She had the strange sensation of hearing a man's mental architecture crack, not loudly, the way buildings fell in movies, but quietly, the way a load-bearing wall sounds when the foundation shifts. A single sound, almost inaudible. What does that mean? He said. Very quiet now. Quieter than the anger, which was more frightening. It means you should talk to your lawyers tonight and come to the meeting tomorrow prepared. She kept her voice level. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Minjai. I'm doing this because you put another woman in my mother's rooms and handed me divorce papers and expected me to thank you for the severance package. You signed the receipt line, he said slowly, not the settlement line. You knew. I knew. Another silence. She heard him move, chair scraping, or maybe he stood up. She imagined him standing in his office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows, the one she'd never liked because it felt like being on display. Maybe that was why he liked it. This isn't you, he said. This isn't Nia, whoever is advising you, whatever you think you're… Minjai. She said his name the same way she'd said it last night, quiet but final. I have been the most consistent person in your life for 9 years. Everything I'm doing right now is completely consistent with who I've always been. You just never look closely enough to see it. She paused. I'll see you tomorrow. Get some sleep. She hung up. Her hands were shaking slightly. She set the phone on the passenger seat and looked at them, allowed them to shake for 30 seconds. Then she pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there until they steadied. That evening, she stayed in the service department she'd reserved that morning, a clean, impersonal place in Yongsan that had no memories attached to it, which was precisely why she'd chosen it. She ordered food she barely tasted. She called her sister Ariez in Chicago and told her the short version. It was happening. She was okay. The trust was intact. She'd explain more when she could. Ariez, who was 6 years older and had never trusted Minjay with anything more than polite dinner conversation, said only, Dad knew. And then, tell me if you need me to fly out. Nia said she would. She wouldn't, not yet, but knowing the option existed was its own kind of solidity. She slept better than she expected. The meeting the next morning was in a glass tower in Gangnam, 41st floor, a conference room that had clearly been designed to make the people sitting on the other side of the table feel small. Long table, power chairs on the Kong group side, standard chairs on the guest side. Nia had seen this move before. Minjai's lawyers used it on opponents they expected to intimidate. She arrived 7 minutes early, set her folder on the table, and moved her chair to the head of the long side, equidistant from both parties. A small thing. But the lawyer across from her, Han Jae-won, noticed. She saw him notice. Minji arrived 4 minutes later. He looked like a man who had not slept well, which was new. Min Jae-kong did not look like a man who had not slept well. In 22 years, she had almost never seen fatigue on his face. He was one of those people whose physical discipline was so habitual it persisted even when everything else was unraveling. But there were shadows under his eyes now, and his jaw was set in a way that said he was working to keep it still, and he looked at her across the conference room with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment. Then she recognized it. He was afraid. Not of her exactly. Of what she represented. of the fact that he had been standing on ground he never surveyed, and he was only now in this 41st floor conference room with its view of the Seoul skyline, understanding what that meant. He sat down. He didn't look away from her. "Let's begin," Cho-yeon-hee said. What followed was 3 hours of the most controlled, quietly devastating legal conversation Nia had ever witnessed. Cho worked through the trust instruments, layer by layer, primary, secondary, tertiary, laying out with absolute precision what belonged to James Okoye's estate held in trust for his daughter, what had been erroneously represented in the Kang Group's portfolio, and what the implications were for current and pending business arrangements. Min-jae's lawyers interrupted 17 times. Nia counted. Each interruption was met by Cho with documentation. Each counterargument was met with a cross-reference. By the second hour, Han Jae-won had stopped interrupting and was writing furiously in the margin of his own notes, and Min-jae had stopped looking at the documents and was looking at Nia instead. She didn't look back at him, not because she was performing coldness, because she genuinely needed to focus on the documents, and because she had spent 9 years managing her reactions to his gaze, and she decided, done managing herself around him. At the end of the third hour, Han Jae-won asked for a week's recess to review. 3 days, Cho said. A pause. 5. 3, Cho said again. Her voice had the quality of a door that had already been closed. The alliance review process your client initiated with Park Do-hyun's organization is already underway. Every day of delay is a day of exposure for the Kang Group's pending agreements. 3 days is generous. Han looked at Min-jae. Min-jae said nothing for a moment. Then, 3 days. The meeting ended. People gathered papers. Cho spoke quietly with one of her associates. Min-jae's team filed toward the door. Min-jae himself didn't move. He sat at the table while his own lawyers left, watching Nia pack her folder. When the room had emptied enough, he said, "I want 5 minutes." Cho looked at Nia. Nia nodded once. Cho stepped outside. The associate followed. The room was quiet, just the two of them and the skyline through the glass. "When did you decide?" he said. She looked at him. "To do this?" "To stop waiting for me to change." She considered that. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd said to her in years. Maybe ever. The particular honesty of a man who had run out of angles. "The East Wing," she said simply. "My mother's rooms." That was the moment. He absorbed that. She watched it land on him. Watched him sit with the specific weight of having gone too far, crossed a line he couldn't identify until it was already behind him. For just a moment, something moved across his face that might have been genuine. Not regret exactly. She wasn't sure Min-jae Kang was built for regret in the way other people were. But something adjacent to it. Something that knew the cost. "I was wrong," he said, flat, direct, no inflection. "Yes." "About more than the rooms." "Yes." He looked at the table, then back at her. "Is there anything—" He stopped, tried again. "Is there any version of this where—" "No," she said. Not unkindly, but without hesitation. He nodded, just once. A man accepting a door that had closed. She picked up her folder. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him say her name. Not as a summons, not as an argument. Just her name, the way you say a word when you're trying to remember the weight of it. She didn't turn around. She stepped into the corridor where Cho was waiting, and the elevator doors at the end of the hall were already open, and she walked toward them without looking back. And in 4 days, the alliance review documents would land on Park Do-hyun's desk, with a revised asset list that would rewrite the entire architecture of the deal. And in 6 days, 3 of Min-jae's senior lieutenants would request an emergency meeting about the syndicate's exposure. And in 9 days, someone would leak the trust dispute to the financial press, and the story would begin to move in the world beyond lawyers and conference rooms. But right now, walking down a Gangnam corridor at noon on a Wednesday, all she was thinking was that she had said her mother's name in that room. Not out loud, but in the reason she gave, the East Wing, my mother's rooms. And it had felt like the first honest sentence she had spoken inside Min-jae's world in a very long time. The elevator doors closed behind her. 3 floors down, her phone buzzed. A message from Do-hyun. "My team completed the preliminary asset review. I think you should see what we found before the 3-day window closes. Are you available this afternoon?" She typed back, "Yes. Send me the location." She didn't know yet what his team had found. She didn't know that what they'd found was not just a discrepancy in asset ownership, but evidence of something more deliberate, a pattern of misrepresentation that went beyond Min Jae's carelessness, that suggested his lawyers had known exactly what the trust covered, and had structured the alliance pitch specifically to obscure it. She didn't know that seeing that evidence would change the nature of what she was doing from a personal legal dispute into something that could bring down the alliances Min Jae had spent 2 decades building. She didn't know any of that yet. But the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened, and she walked out into the Seoul afternoon, and somewhere across the city park, Do-hyun's team was spreading documents across a conference table, and the shape of what was coming was already there, already visible to anyone who knew how to look. Do-hyun's office was on the 23rd floor of a building in Mapo that looked, from the outside, like any other mid-tier corporate tower. Deliberate, Nia suspected. Men like Park Do-hyun did not advertise. She had come to understand that about him in the short time she'd known him. He kept his actual weight invisible until the moment it needed to be felt. His assistant showed her into a conference room where 3 people were already seated around a table covered in printed documents, spreadsheets, and what looked like transaction logs printed in a font small enough to require reading glasses. Do-hyun stood at the window with his back to her, hands clasped, looking at the Han River. He turned when she walked in. "Thank you for coming quickly," he said. "Your message made it sound urgent." "It is." He didn't waste time on preamble. He moved to the table, picked up a document, and held it out to her. "This is a transaction log from one of the Singapore routing accounts, the one attached to the Busan warehouse network." She took it. She scanned the columns. Numbers, dates, account codes. Then she stopped. "These transfers," she said. "Look at the dates." She looked. 18 months ago, 14 months, 11, 8, 6. A pattern of transfers, moving in increments just small enough to avoid automatic flagging, flowing out of the Singapore account into a secondary account she didn't recognize. "Whose account is this?" she said. She kept her voice flat. "That's what we needed to tell you in person." Do-hyun pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked tired, not the way Min Jae had looked tired, not the fatigue of a man caught off guard, but the tiredness of someone who had been awake since 3 in the morning because what he'd found hadn't let him sleep. The secondary account traces back through 2 shell registrations in the Cayman Islands. The beneficial owner on the final registration is a company called CO RIM International Holdings. Nia set the paper down. She sat down. She placed both hands on the table, flat, the way she'd trained herself to do when her body wanted to do something else. "Seorin," she said, "the account was opened 22 months ago." Do-hyun's voice was careful, not gentle. He knew she didn't need gentle, but measured, the way you'd speak to someone you respected enough not to soften a thing for. "The transfers began 16 months ago. They've been consistent, regular intervals, amounts that individually wouldn't trigger scrutiny, but collectively. Collectively, they represent approximately 40% of the liquid capital that should be sitting in the Singapore account as operational reserve for the Busan network." He paused. "Capital that backs a portion of your trust's asset value." The room was very quiet. One of his analysts, a young woman with a yellow highlighter frozen halfway to a page, had gone completely still, the way people go still when they're watching something difficult happen to someone and don't know where to look. "She's been draining it," Nia said. "Someone has been. For 22 months. She said it again, not because she needed to repeat it for understanding, but because she needed to hear the number out loud, needed to feel the full span of it. 22 months. Seorin had been in Min Jae's life for at least 22 months, while Nia had been reviewing quarterly reports in the study, while her mother was still alive, while she was still telling herself things would change. "Miss Okoye." Do-hyun leaned slightly forward. "There's more." She looked at him. The transfers weren't made by Seorin directly. The authorization signatures on the transfer orders, he slid another document across the table, belonged to someone with full signatory authority over the Singapore account. She looked at the signatures. She recognized the handwriting. She had seen it on contracts, on agreements, on the birthday cards he'd stopped signing with anything personal years ago, reduced to just his name in that same distinctive slant. Min Jae. "He knew," she said. He authorized every transfer. She picked up the document. She looked at it the way she had looked at the divorce papers, reading, actually reading, taking in each detail with the part of her brain that had been trained in her father's kitchen with a balance sheet on a Tuesday evening. The dates, the amounts, the account codes, the signatures, everything matching, everything consistent, everything pointing to one conclusion that she had not been prepared for. Even though she realized now the shape of it had been visible for a while if she'd been willing to see it. She had thought Min Jae was careless. She had thought he'd simply never read the trust documents, never understood what he didn't own, and that his error was the error of arrogance and inattention. She had built her entire plan around that assumption, around the idea that she was correcting a misunderstanding, not dismantling a deliberate architecture. She had been wrong. "He's been liquidating the Singapore reserves," she said slowly, working through it out loud, "and routing the capital to Seorin's account for 22 months, while simultaneously presenting the Singapore account's nominal balance, the pre-transfer balance, to Alliance partners as collateral." Yes. Which means when Park Alliance due diligence reviewed the account last month, they saw numbers that no longer reflected actual holdings. Yes. She set the document down. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she dropped her hands and looked at Do-hyun. "He wasn't just careless about the trust," she said. "He was using the trust's asset backing as cover for a capital extraction scheme, presenting assets he didn't own as collateral, while draining the liquid reserves that gave those assets operational value. That's what the documents suggest. That's fraud," she said. "That's not a marital asset dispute. That's financial fraud on multiple entities, including your organization." Do-hyun held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it is." The room shifted, not physically. Nothing moved, but the weight in it changed, the way air pressure changes before a storm. Nia felt it in her chest and in the back of her throat and in the particular stillness of her hands on the table. She had come into this prepared for a legal fight, prepared to correct a record, recover what belonged to her family's trust, walk away from a marriage with her dignity and her assets intact. She had not been prepared for this. For the revelation that the man she had spent 9 years protecting, managing, quietly building around, had, for nearly 2 of those years, been actively exploiting the legal infrastructure of her family's estate to fund a relationship he was hiding from everyone, including his own lawyers. "Does his legal team know?" she said. "I don't believe so. The shell company structure is sophisticated enough that it wouldn't have surfaced in standard due diligence. We found it because we were specifically looking at the Singapore account after the discrepancy in your trust instruments flagged it. If his lawyers don't know, they've been operating on false information. Every representation they made in yesterday's meeting was made in good faith but based on numbers their client knew were inaccurate." "Yes." She stood up. She didn't pace. She wasn't a pacer. But she stood because sitting felt like absorbing something, and she needed to be upright, needed to feel the floor under her feet. "If this comes out in the Alliance review," she said, "and it will come out, it can't not come out now. It doesn't just affect the Kong Group's deal with your organization. It affects every partnership, every political relationship, every legitimate investor who's been presented with those Singapore account figures as evidence of capital strength." "I know. The syndicate's exposure is enormous, not just legal exposure. The people inside the organization who trusted the financial picture Min Jae presented, Baek Sung-il and the operational team. They've been making decisions based on reserves that don't fully exist." "I know," Do-hyun said again. "Ms. Okoye, how long do we have before this becomes impossible to contain quietly?" He looked at his watch. "The 3-day review window closes Friday. If my organization submits a formal finding of material misrepresentation. Before then, it triggers mandatory disclosure protocols under the Alliance framework. That goes to every party in the deal." He paused. "That's 42 hours from now." She looked at him. "You're going to have to submit it." "Yes." "You can't not." "No, I can't." His voice was steady, not defensive, just clear. "I want you to understand that this isn't a choice I'm making against Min Jae, or for you. It's an obligation I have to the partners in my organization who relied on the accuracy of those figures." "I know." She nodded once. "I'm not asking you not to. I'm asking how we manage what happens when you do." Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, he was not an easily surprised man, but something like relief. The relief of a person who had expected to have to argue for the right thing and found instead they were already past the argument. "Tell me what you need," he said. What she needed was 40 minutes and a phone that no one had tapped. She had no certainty about the second part, so she used her own phone and accepted the risk, stepping into the corridor outside Do Hyun's conference room and calling Cho Yeon-hee directly. She explained the Singapore account in 4 sentences. She heard Cho's breathing change, very slightly, but she heard it. And then Cho said, "Send me everything Do Hyun's team has compiled, right now, before anything else. It may implicate the lawyers in his lawyers, not mine. And it implicates them only if they knew, which you just told me you don't think they did. That's a different problem. Send me the documents." Nia went back into the conference room and arranged for Do Hyun's team to transmit directly to Cho's secure server. That took 11 minutes. While it was happening, her phone rang. Baek Sung-il's number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Miss Okoye." His voice was tight. Tighter than she'd ever heard it. Beck was an ex-military man, calm by training, and even at his most tense he kept a certain flatness in his delivery. Right now the flatness was under strain. "I need to speak with you, not about the trust, about something else." "What is it?" "Not on the phone." A pause. "I've been loyal to Min Jae for 14 years. I need you to understand that before I say anything else." She looked through the glass wall of the conference room at Do Hyun, who was watching her with the focused attention of someone who understood that something significant was happening in a corridor 11 feet away. "Where?" she said. "Anywhere you choose, somewhere public. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not trying to intimidate you. I want you to feel safe." 60 minutes, the lobby cafe of the Signal Seoul. "I'll be there." She went back into the room. "I need to step out for an hour," she told Do Hyun. "Something's come up." He looked at her face. He didn't ask questions. "Take one of my associates with you," he said. "Young-hee." He nodded toward the young woman with the highlighter. "She's discreet. She can wait outside wherever you're going." Nia started to decline. Then she thought about 42 hours and the Singapore account and Min Jae's face in the conference room that morning, the fear beneath the composure, and she thought, he is a man who is running out of options, and running out of options does specific things to men like him. "All right," she said. Baek Sung-il was already at the cafe when she arrived. He was a large man, wide-shouldered, built like someone who had spent decades expecting physical conflict. And he sat in a cafe chair with the particular self-consciousness of a big man in a delicate space. He had a coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He stood when she walked in, more out of reflex than courtesy. She sat across from him. He sat back down. "Talk," she said. He looked at his untouched coffee, then at her. His face was doing something complicated. The work of a man dismantling a loyalty he'd been carrying for 14 years and trying to understand which pieces to keep. 3 months ago, he said, I found a discrepancy in the operational budget for the Busan network. I brought it to Min Jae. He told me it was a routing error from the Singapore account and that he was handling it. I believed him. He stopped. 2 months ago, I found another discrepancy. Different account, same pattern. I brought it to him again. This time he told me it was a strategic reallocation and that the details were above my clearance level. His jaw tightened. I have been with this organization for 14 years. I have never been told something was above my clearance level. But you let it go, Nia said. I let it go. His voice was flat with self-disgust. He was my boss. He had never given me reason to think he was stealing from his own operation. He wasn't stealing from the operation, she said carefully. He was using trust-backed assets as collateral while liquidating the reserves. The operational budget discrepancies you found were the downstream effect. The reserves weren't there to cover routine operational transfers, so the budget was absorbing the gap. Beck looked at her. You already know about the Singapore account. I found out an hour ago. How bad is it? She held his gaze. Bad enough that my attorney is reviewing it right now. Bad enough that an alliance partner's due diligence will produce a mandatory disclosure in 42 hours. He absorbed that. She watched the color leave his face, not dramatically, not movie style, but the slow, quiet draining that happens when a large, solid fact lands in the body and begins spreading through it. The syndicate's lieutenants, he said. If a mandatory disclosure goes out, they'll know within hours. Some of them will panic. Yes. Some of them will do stupid things. Yes. She leaned slightly forward. Bayek, I need you to tell me why you called me and not Minjai's lawyers. Or Minjay. He was quiet for a moment. A couple at the next table laughed about something. The sound was absurd, the ordinary cheerfulness of people who did not know what was being said 11 inches away. Because Minjay told me last night that if things went badly with the trust dispute, he was going to find a way to make the problem yours. Beck's voice was very quiet. Not threatening, confessional. The voice of a man reporting something he was ashamed to have heard and more ashamed to have let pass without acting on it. He said your signatures were on enough of the legitimate side documentation that if things went to a formal legal investigation, there were ways to make the paper trail point in directions that would be, he searched for the word, complicated for you. Nia sat very still. He didn't say it directly, Beck continued. He said it the way he says things he doesn't want to own, sideways, implying. But I've worked for this man for 14 years and I know what he means when he says something sideways. He met her eyes. He's going to try to use you as a shield. Your name is on every legitimate business document. If the fraud investigation goes where it goes, he'll argue you were the architect, that he trusted you and you misled him. The cafe noise continued around them, indifferent. Nia's hands were on the table and they were not shaking. She was very specifically making sure they were not shaking because she needed Beck to see steadiness, and because she needed herself to be steadier than she currently felt in her chest, where something cold and hard had just set up residence. She had not seen this coming. She should have. She understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had made a fundamental mistake. She had been so focused on the trust, on the asset structure, on the legitimate legal architecture of her response, that she had not sufficiently accounted for what Minjay would do when he realized the ground was disappearing beneath him. She had thought his fear would make him retreat. She had forgotten that the men she'd known like Minjay did not retreat. They redirected. They found another body to put between themselves and the consequence. And she had spent 9 years signing her name to the legitimate face of his empire. How many documents, she said, her voice was even. She hated how even her voice was, while her thoughts were moving this fast in this many directions at once. Every contract, every compliance filing, every partnership agreement for the legitimate subsidiaries, for 9 years. Beck paused. I don't know how strong a case he can build. I'm not a lawyer. But I know he spent 2 hours last night with someone who wasn't one of his regular legal team, someone I didn't recognize. What did this person look like? Beck described him. She didn't recognize the description, but she filed every detail: height, approximate age, the color of the briefcase. Why are you telling me this? She said. He looked at his coffee. Because I have a daughter, he said. She's 24. She just graduated university. He paused. I don't know what that has to do with anything. He stopped. Tried again. I've done a lot of things in 14 years that I can't undo. I can do this. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, I need you to write down everything you just told me. Names, dates, what he said, who the unknown person was as best you can describe him. My attorney's secure address. She slid a business card across the table. Send it there within the hour. And then? And then you protect yourself. You have 14 years of operational knowledge that the syndicate's legitimate partners will need when this restructures. Make sure you're on the right side of this before the disclosure goes out. He looked at the card. He picked it up. He stood, and she stood, and he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected judgment and received instruction instead, and wasn't entirely sure which of those things he deserved. Miss Okoye, he said, for whatever it's worth. We all knew who was actually running the legitimate side. Minjay knew it too. That was part of the problem, I think. Men like him. He stopped. They can't stand being held up by something they didn't build, even when they need it. He left. She stood at the table for a moment. Yoonghee was visible through the glass, waiting near the entrance, deliberately looking elsewhere. Nia picked up her phone and called Cho. He's going to try to reverse the narrative, she said when Cho picked up. He's been planning it. He's going to use my signatures on the legitimate subsidiary documents to position me as the architect of the fraud. He's already meeting with outside counsel, we don't know. Cho's response came immediately, without a pause for surprise or reassurance. How long have we had before we already knew this was possible? Nia stopped. What? Nia. Cho's voice was brisk but not unkind. I've been practicing law for 30 years. The moment you walked into my office with 9 years of signatures on legitimate documents belonging to a crime-adjacent empire, I knew this was a possible move. I've been preparing for it. Where are you right now? A cafe in. Get back to Do Hyun's office. I'm going to need his team's full Singapore documentation, and I'm going to need it formatted in a way that makes the authorization chain absolutely unambiguous before anything goes to disclosure. The fraud has to be attributed correctly and completely before Min Jae's outside counsel gets to file anything. Can you be at Do Hyun's office in 20 minutes? Yes. Then go. She went. She moved through the lobby with Jung Hee half a step behind her and her phone already dialing Do Hyun's number, and the city moved around her. The Tuesday afternoon soul of ordinary people with ordinary problems, taxis and pedestrians, and the smell of street food from somewhere down the block. And she felt none of it, was permeable to none of it, because the full weight of what was happening had settled into her with a clarity that was almost cold. Min Jae was going to try to make this her crime. He had 9 years of her signature. He had motive to construct. She had just initiated a trust dispute, revealed his financial exposure, potentially cost him a major alliance. He would say she had manipulated him from the beginning, that she had structured the trust to entrap him, that she had run the legitimate subsidiaries in ways designed to obscure her own extractions. He would build a version of events in which Nia Okoye was not the wronged wife protecting her inheritance, but the sophisticated man as cover for a decade of financial manipulation. It would not be true, but it would be documented. And documentation, she knew better than almost anyone, was the thing that outlasted truth in a legal fight. She had 41 hours before Do Hyun's disclosure went out. She had Cho. She had Baek Sung-il's testimony about what Min Jae had said last night. She had the Singapore transaction logs with Min Jae's own authorization signatures on every transfer. She had, she hoped, enough. She was not sure she had enough. Do Hyun met her at the elevator when she arrived. He took one look at her face and said nothing, just stepped aside and let her walk toward the conference room. She was almost through the door when she stopped and turned back to him. He's going to come after me, she said. Not just in the divorce proceeding, criminally. He's going to try to construct a case in which I'm the architect of the fraud. Do Hyun looked at her. His expression did not change in the way people's expressions change when they're surprised. It changed in a different way. The tightening of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed, who had been hoping to be wrong. Then we need to build the counter record before he files anything, he said. My legal team is here. Your attorney is on the phone. We have 41 hours. He held the conference room door open. Tell me what you need and I'll tell you what I can provide. She walked through the door. The documents were still spread across the table. The Singapore transaction logs, the shell company registrations, the transfer authorization signatures with Min Jae's handwriting in every column. She stood over them and looked at the architecture of what he had done and felt, beneath the fear and the cold clarity and the calculating sprint of her mind through options and counter-options, something she hadn't expected. Fury. Not the hot, immediate fury of last night in the foyer with another woman standing in her home. Something older. Something that had been building for a long time and had just found the specific shape it needed to become real. He had handed her divorce papers. He had put his mistress in her mother's rooms. And when that wasn't enough, when she had stood up instead of sitting down, had walked away instead of disappearing, he had decided to make her criminal. She pulled out a chair. She sat down. She looked at Do Hyun across the table. Start with the authorization chain, she said. Every transfer, every signature in chronological order. I want it clean enough that there is no ambiguity about who made every single decision. Do Hyun nodded to his team. They moved. Outside the window, Seoul was going dark. They worked through the night, not the productive, focused kind of working through the night that gets romanticized. This was ugly, grinding work. The kind that left coffee rings on documents and made people's eyes go red at the rims and produced silences between people that weren't companionable but necessary. Gaps where someone needed 30 seconds to stop thinking in order to start thinking again. Do Hyun's team was 4 people. Jung Hee, who turned out to have a forensic accounting background that explained the highlighter and the stillness. A man named Ryu, who handled corporate law and communicated primarily through frowns of varying intensity. A younger associate named Pak, who had been awake for what looked like 30 hours already and was running on something that was not quite coffee and not quite adrenaline but some compound of both. And Do-hyun himself, who did not appear to need sleep the way other people needed it, but who, around 2 in the morning, took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves and became, in that small gesture, a different and slightly more human version of himself. Cho Yeon-hee was on video from her office, her screen propped against a stack of her own documents, occasionally disappearing from frame to retrieve something and returning without explanation. She and Ryu had developed, over the course of 4 hours, a shorthand that involved a lot of document references and very few complete sentences. Nia was at the end of the table with a legal pad and a pen. She had stopped using the pen for notes around midnight and had started using it to keep her hands occupied, turning it end over end, a habit from childhood she'd mostly broken except under extreme pressure. She caught herself doing it twice and stopped both times. What they were building was a counter-record, not a defense, a preemptive documentation of the complete, accurate, and unambiguous financial history of every transaction Min Jae's outside counsel might attempt to attribute to Nia. Every authorization chain for every legitimate subsidiary filing. Every compliance document showing Nia's signature alongside the specific instructions she'd been given, the paper trail proving she had operated as an authorized officer executing directives rather than as an independent architect of financial strategy. Every email, every memo, every board record that showed the decision-making structure. Min Jae at the top, Nia implementing. It was painstaking, and it was necessary, and it was the most frightened she had been since this started. Because she understood, working through it, how good the case against her could look. How easy it would be. For someone who knew what they were doing, someone Min Jae had apparently already retained, to take 9 years of her professional competence and reframe it as evidence of her control. She had been thorough. She had been meticulous. She had caught errors and corrected them and documented the corrections and built systems so efficient that Min Jae had never had to think about the legitimate side of his operation at all. Every one of those qualities, in the wrong hands and under the wrong light, became a data point in the story of a woman who ran everything. She turned the pen over in her fingers at 3:47 in the morning and thought, he knew. He always knew how good I was at this. And he kept me in that role specifically because of how good I was at it. And now he's going to use that against me. The fury was still there. Cleaner now than it had been earlier. Less hot. At 4:15, Cho said from the screen, "The Beck documentation came through. His account of what Min Jae said the night after the first meeting is going to be critical. It establishes intent." She looked at something off-screen. "It's also going to make Min Jae's outside counsel very uncomfortable because it suggests their client is planning to commit perjury, which creates a professional obligation problem for them." She paused. "They may withdraw. Or they may not have been told what Min Jae actually has planned," Ryu said without looking up. "Also possible," Cho said. "If they withdraw close to the disclosure deadline," Nia started, "it creates chaos on his side, yes, which is not nothing." Cho finally looked directly at the camera. "Nia, I need you to hear something. Go ahead." "What we're building tonight is strong. The authorization chain is clear. Beck's testimony is credible. The Singapore transaction logs have Min Jae's signatures and no one else's. The counter record, as it stands right now, is strong enough that any competent prosecutor reviewing this file would look at the evidence and understand what actually happened." She paused. "But I want you to be realistic. Min Jae has resources we don't fully know. He has relationships with people in positions that affect how investigations proceed. This may not be over quickly. It may not be clean." "I know," Nia said. "Do you?" "Cho." Nia set the pen down. "I've known this man for 22 years. I know exactly what he's capable of, and I know exactly what his resources look like. I'm not expecting clean." She held the screen's gaze even though it was just a camera. "I'm expecting to be right. That's what I'm working on tonight." A beat. Then Cho said, "Good. Keep going." They kept going. By 6 in the morning, what they had was 140 pages of documented counter-record, organized by subsidiary, by date, by decision chain. Young-hee had produced a visual authorization flowchart that made the power structure of the Kong Group's legitimate holdings immediately comprehensible to anyone, including anyone who had no background in corporate finance and might be sitting on a jury. Do Hyun had personally reviewed the Singapore transaction log analysis 3 times and signed a declaration as a witness to his organization's findings. Ryu had prepared the formal disclosure notice for the alliance framework, ready to file the moment the 30-hour mark hit. Nia had written, in her own handwriting, a 4-page personal account of her role in the Kong Group's legitimate operations, what she had been asked to do, what authority she'd had, what decisions had required Min Jae's explicit approval, and what had happened to the information she'd produced. It was not a legal document, it was a human one. Cho had asked for it, not for evidentiary value, but because, she said, there would be moments in what was coming when the clearest thing in the room would need to be a person's own account of what they knew and when. At 6:45, Do Hyun walked Nia out to the elevator, just the two of them. The office behind them was quiet, with the specific exhaustion of people who had worked past the point where the work feels urgent and arrived at the place where it just feels true. Go sleep for a few hours, he said. I need to be at Cho's by 10. That's 3 hours. Sleep. She looked at him. He looked back. He had the particular quality she had noticed over the past 12 hours of not filling silence with noise, of being comfortable in it in a way that wasn't cold but wasn't performing warmth either. Just present, just there. Do Hyun see? She said. Yes. Thank you. She said it the way she meant it, which was not as a courtesy, but as an acknowledgement of something real. He had kept his organization's involvement when he could have withdrawn. He had put his team's time and credibility into a fight that was not, strictly speaking, his. He had done it with a consistency of purpose that she found, in her exhaustion and her fury and her fear, genuinely steadying. He nodded, not dismissively, just accepting it without making it more than it was. I'll see you at the reception, he said. She stopped. What reception? He looked at her carefully. The Kong Group's international expansion reception, Thursday night at the Grand Walker Hill. It was on the alliance calendar. He paused. Min Jae will be there. Every significant investor, political contact, and criminal alliance partner he has will be there. He's been planning this event for 4 months. It's meant to be his public declaration of the alliance moving forward. Another pause. Miss Okoye. The disclosure goes out Thursday morning, 6 hours before that reception begins. She stared at him. He won't cancel it, Do Hyun said. He can't. Canceling it would signal collapse before he's had a chance to manage the narrative. He'll go. He'll try to hold the room. And you, she said slowly, are going to be there. As the representative of the alliance's lead partner, yes, I'm required to be there. He looked at her. I think you should come. She understood what he was saying. She turned it over in her mind. The full weight of it, the risk of it, the thing it would mean to walk into that room after the disclosure had gone out, on Do Hyun's arm, in front of every person whose opinion of Min Jae's stability and authority would already be in question. That's not walking into a reception, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was not enough and was what she had. She showered in the service department and stood under the water until it went cold, and then stood in it for another 30 seconds because the cold felt like information, like something real and specific happening to her body, which she needed. She ate half of a convenience store rice triangle she'd bought the night before. She called a Diaz. It's getting complicated, she said, which was the largest understatement she had produced in a life not short on them. Tell me the truth, Adeyezi said immediately. Not anxious, sharp. Adeyezi had their father's accountant brain and their mother's refusal to be managed. So Nia told her the truth, all of it, the Singapore account, Min Jae's counter-strategy, the 41 hours, the reception. Adiz was quiet for a moment after. Then, he put his mistress in Mama's rooms. Yes. And now he's going to try to make you a criminal. He's going to try. Another silence. What do you need? Nothing right now, I just needed to tell someone who isn't a lawyer. I'm booking a flight, Adiaz said. Ada, I'm not asking. A pause. I'll be there by Thursday afternoon. Text me the address. The line went dead. Naya set the phone down and looked at the ceiling of the small impersonal room and felt something move through her that she could not have named for anyone. Not relief, not quite love, though it was related to love. The feeling of being known by someone who had known you before you became any particular thing, before you were Min Jae's wife, before you were James Okoye's daughter with the trust in the filing cabinet. Just Naya. Just the person underneath. She got up and went to Cho's office. The disclosure went out at 9:53 Thursday morning. Ryu filed it through the Alliance Framework's formal channel, copied to every party on the registered agreement. 14 organizations, 22 individuals, 4 governmental liaison contacts. It was 42 pages, including attachments. The cover letter was 3 paragraphs, formal and precise, citing material misrepresentation of collateral assets and triggering mandatory independent review. Nia was in Cho's conference room when Ryu sent the confirmation. She watched the timestamp appear on the forwarded notification and felt her chest do something complicated. Cho's phone rang 11 minutes later. Then again. Then again. She stopped answering after the third call and let them go to her assistant. Nia's phone rang at 10:22. Min Jae's number. She let it ring. It rang again at 10:31, again at 10:44. At 11 o'clock it stopped, and she understood from the stopping that he had been told something by someone. His lawyers, one of his lieutenants. Someone who had reviewed the disclosure and given him a number, a picture, a scale of what he was looking at, and that the calls had stopped because he was now doing something other than calling her. At noon, Cho received a communication from Han Jae-won's office. The senior partner of the firm, not Han himself, the senior partner, requesting an urgent meeting. Cho agreed to 2 o'clock. What do you think that means? Nia asked. It means the senior partner has read the disclosure documentation and has realized that his firm has been representing a client who withheld material facts that affect their counsel's ethical obligations. Cho's voice was precise. It means they're considering withdrawal, and they want to tell me first so I don't file a bar complaint before they can document that they're doing the right thing. Will you? Cho looked at her. File a bar complaint? Not if they move quickly and cleanly. She paused. I want Min Jae exposed, not his lawyers. His lawyers are probably just men who believe their client. At 1:45, Nia went back to the service department to change for the reception. She stood in front of the single narrow wardrobe and looked at the small number of things she'd brought with her when she left the mansion 3 days ago. 2 work outfits, 1 pair of running shoes she hadn't used, and the dress she'd packed without fully understanding why she was packing it. Dark navy, structured, the kind of thing that read as serious without reading as defeated. She'd bought it 8 months ago for a board meeting. She'd ended up skipping because Min Jae had a conflict and needed her elsewhere. She put it on. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, not performing anything, just looking, the way you look at a stranger to understand who they are before they start talking. She looked like someone who had slept 2 hours and 40 minutes, which she was. She also looked like someone who had made a decision, which she had. Adaez arrived at the hotel lobby at 4:15, which was 45 minutes before the reception was scheduled to begin. She was 6 years older than Nia and 4 inches shorter and had the bearing of a woman who had never once, in her life, made herself smaller for the convenience of a room. She walked in pulling a carry-on and found Nia sitting in a lobby chair with a glass of water and a face that had been through several different things in the past 72 hours. Adaez sat down beside her. She didn't hug her immediately. She just looked at her, the way Adaez looked at things she was assessing, directly, thoroughly, without sentimentality. You look terrible, she said. Thank you. You also look like you know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing. Adaez took the water glass out of Nia's hand and took a drink. Then she handed it back. Tell me about this chairman. He's not... Nia stopped. He helped. And he's going to be there tonight. Yes. And you're walking in with him. Yes. Adaez was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad would have liked someone who reads the secondary trust instruments. Nia almost smiled for the second time in 3 days. The muscles for it still felt uncertain. Do-hyun arrived at 5 minutes to 5. I was in a dark suit with no tie, which was, Nia would think later, exactly the right choice. Dressed for a serious occasion without dressed for a performance of power. He saw Adaez first, assessed the situation in approximately 1 second, and extended his hand. Chairman Park, Adaez said, shaking it. I'm the sister. I flew 14 hours to watch this. Then I hope it's worth the flight, he said. Adaez looked at Nia. Nia looked at her water glass. They took the elevator to the grand ballroom floor of the Walker Hill at 5:05. The reception was supposed to begin at 5. Min Jae was supposed to make his address at 6. Nia calculated. The disclosure had been out for 7 hours. Min-jae had known about it for at least 6. He had had 6 hours to decide what to do about tonight, and he had chosen to go through with it, which told her something important about where his head was. He believed he could still hold the room. He believed, even now, in his own ability to walk into a space and make it his. She had been watching him do that for 22 years. She knew exactly how he did it, and she knew, for the first time, that she knew something about this room that he did not. She knew what was in those 42 pages. She knew who had read them and what they now understood. She knew that the room she was walking into was not the room Min-jae thought he was walking into. The ballroom was full, 200 people at least. She recognized faces from Min-jae's legitimate investment circles, politicians she'd managed relationships with for years, foreign business representatives who'd flown in from Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, the American contingent from the Chicago real estate consortium she'd spent a year cultivating, and the other kind of people, the kind who wore expensive suits and didn't speak much, and whose presence at these events was understood rather than explained. The room had a particular quality when they walked in. Not silence, people were talking, the ambient noise of a reception in progress, but a kind of awareness, a ripple. Because the disclosure had been out for 7 hours, and some of these people had received it directly as registered parties, and some of them had heard about it secondhand in the hours since, and all of them had been processing what it meant. And now Nia Okoye was walking through the door on Park Do-hyun's arm, and the processing accelerated. She felt it. The attention. The recalibration. The way people's conversations paused fractionally when they saw her, and then resumed with a different quality, the quality of conversations that had just found their most relevant new data point. Do-hyun did not speed up or slow down. He kept their pace steady and unhurried. His hand was at her elbow, not gripping, not guiding, just present, the small signal of a person who was there and choosing to be there. She saw Min-jae before he saw her. He was on the far side of the room near the bar, talking to 3 men she recognized as major investors in the Tokyo expansion. His posture was the posture she'd seen him hold for 20 years at events like this, upright, slightly turned, giving whoever he was speaking to the impression of his full attention while actually managing the whole room in his peripheral vision. He was wearing his gray suit, the one she'd told him once looked like authority. He had listened to her about the suit. Then his peripheral vision caught something and his head turned just slightly, and he saw her. She watched his face. She was good at his face. Better than anyone alive, probably. Better than Seorin, who was standing 6 feet away looking at her phone and didn't yet know what was happening. She watched Min-jae's face go through, in approximately 2 seconds, a sequence of things that he would never have let anyone see if he'd had the fraction of a second to prepare. Shock. Genuine, unguarded shock. She was here. She was here, and she was with Do-hyun, and she was wearing navy, and her face was the face of a person who had made a decision and arrived at a reception as the consequence of it. Then the composure came back. She watched it come, the architecture sliding into place, the social mask settling, but it settled differently than it had before. She could see the effort in it now. She had never been able to see the effort before. Theorin looked up from her phone and followed Min-jae's eyeline and found Nia. Something complicated passed over her face. Not the measured, almost apologetic expression from that night in the foyer. Something rawer. Fear, maybe. Or the specific discomfort of a person who had told themselves a story in which they were not the villain and was finding the story increasingly difficult to maintain. Do-hyun leaned slightly toward Nia. The 3 men he's speaking with, Suzuki, Tanaka, and Park Won-sik, all 3 received the disclosure directly as registered alliance parties. I know them, Nia said. I managed the relationship with Suzuki's Tokyo office for 3 years. Then go manage it. She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was not pushing. It was offering. Here's the room. You know this room. Go. She crossed the ballroom floor. She did not look at Min-jae while she walked toward him. She looked at Tanaka first. He was the most lateral of the 3, standing slightly apart, and when she made eye contact with him, she saw recognition and then calculation and then, unmistakably, relief. The relief of a man who has been standing next to someone he just discovered was standing on unstable ground and has just seen a more stable place to stand appear. Okoye-san, Tanaka said, and his voice was warm in a way that would not have been lost on anyone in earshot. Tanaka-san, She took his extended hand. It's good to see you. I hope the flight from Tokyo was manageable. Always too long. His eyes flicked to Minjae, very briefly, very controlled, and back to her. We received some documentation this morning. I know, she said. I wanted to make sure you had the opportunity to ask questions from the right source. She let that sit for exactly one beat. The right source. Not his side. Her side. The side that sent the disclosure. She felt Minjae's gaze on the side of her face like a physical pressure. She did not turn to it. Suzuki stepped forward. He was older than the others, 70s, with the measured precision of a man who had survived multiple market collapses and several changes of government. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as his version of approval, not warm, but attentive. The look that meant she had his actual attention rather than his social attention. The trust documentation, he said. The secondary instruments. These were established before the marriage. 2 years before, she said. By my father. He was a financial architect. He believed in structural protection. He didn't trust improvised arrangements. A wise man, Suzuki said, and then very quietly, so that only she and the small circle could hear. The Singapore account. We had capital exposure through a partnership instrument attached to the Busan network. The disclosure suggests the reserve backing for that instrument may be reduced. My attorneys and Chairman Park's financial team are available to walk through the exact figures with your advisors tomorrow morning, she said. The documentation is complete. The exposure is recoverable through the trust-held assets, which are intact. Nothing was touched that belonged to your partnership instrument. She held his gaze. I would not have let that happen. Suzuki looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had just made a decision. Minjae spoke. She had been waiting for it, had felt him working up to it, felt the pressure building in the 12 feet between them, and she'd kept her back to it deliberately, buying time, letting the room observe the deliberateness. Nia. His voice was controlled. Tight, but controlled. I didn't know you were attending. She turned. She looked at him directly. He was 4 feet away and he was looking at her with the composed, measuring expression, the one she knew was costing him. She could see what it was costing him. She could see Seorin 3 steps behind him, still with the phone, no longer looking at it. I was invited, she said simply. As the representative of the international trust that holds controlling interest in several assets associated with this expansion. She said it the same way she said everything, so level, clear, no extra weight on any word. I believe that was noted in the disclosure documentation. A sound moved through the people standing closest to them. Not a gasp, nothing so theatrical. More like the collective inhale of people realizing the conversation they were overhearing was not a private one and choosing, each independently, not to move away. You're not the representative of anything, Minjae said, still controlled, just barely. You're my wife. Your ex-wife, she said. The divorce papers were filed this morning. Cho Yeon-hee's office can confirm. She hadn't known he didn't know. She could see that he didn't know. That someone had failed to get that information to him in time, that it had been filed that morning while he was dealing with the disclosure fallout, and no one had passed it up the chain. She hadn't planned to use it as a reveal. It simply was one. His jaw moved. Just once. The smallest visible evidence of what was happening beneath the composed surface. You should have stayed home, he said. His voice had dropped. Not quiet. Low. The register that meant the composure was close to its limit. I don't have a home, she said. You put your mistress in my mother's rooms. The room was fully listening now. Every person within 30 feet had gone still with the specific stillness of witnesses who understand they are watching something that will be described in other rooms for years. Investors. Politicians. The men in expensive suits who didn't speak. All of them. Seorin's face had gone blank in a particular way. The blankness of someone who is deciding, in real time, whether to be here. Minji stepped toward her. Not threatening. He was never going to be openly threatening in a room this full. But closing the distance, making it intimate, trying to force the conversation into a register that was personal rather than public. Everything you're doing, he said quietly. Every document, every disclosure, every move you've made, I built the foundation that made any of it possible. She looked at him, steady. She had been waiting for this too, had known it was coming, The version where he reminded her that she owed him, that everything she had was downstream of his power, that without him, she would have been nothing more than a sharp accountant from Chicago. "The Jeju Island properties," she said. Her voice was quiet too, matching his so that the people immediately around them had to go very still to hear. "The Busan warehouse network, the Singapore routing account, the 4 overseas holding companies, the political relationships that protected every illegal operation you ran for 9 years. She paused. "My father's financial network introduced you to your first international investors. I built the legitimate architecture that allowed you to present as a serious businessman rather than a crime boss with ambitions. I drafted the compliance frameworks. I cultivated the political relationships. I caught the accounting errors that would have exposed you 3 times. She held his gaze. "You didn't build this foundation, Min Jae. You built the rooms. I was the foundation." The silence was total. Not the silence of a room that had stopped to listen. The silence of a room that had heard something true and was absorbing it. Min Jae's eyes changed. She had never seen this in them before, but not anger, not calculation, not the managed composure or the rare glimpse of fear. Something that looked like the last recognition of a man who has just heard an argument he cannot counter, because it is not an argument, it is a ledger, and the ledger is accurate. His hand came up, not a strike. He would never, not in this room, not with 200 witnesses, but a reaching, an instinct to grab her arm, to stop the physical fact of her turning away from him. He didn't reach her. His own security lead, a man named O, who had worked for him for 11 years and had, Nia suspected, also read the disclosure, stepped forward and put a hand on Min Jae's arm before he could close the distance, not restraining him, just present, just there. The hand of a man who was doing his job and whose job had just, quietly, shifted in a direction Min Jae had not authorized. Min Jae looked at O. O met his gaze, did not move his hand. The room had seen it. Every person who mattered had seen it. The feared and impeccably respected head of Seoul's most powerful crime syndicate had reached for his ex-wife in a ballroom full of his allies and had been stopped by his own man. Do-hyun appeared at Nia's left side. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Min Jae, who was looking at O's hand on his arm with the expression of a man understanding something fully for the first time. That the authority he had always believed was absolute, the kind that came from fear and from the careful cultivation of loyalty over decades, had a boundary. And the boundary was here, in this room, in this moment, with his ex-wife standing 4 feet away in a navy dress, not breathing hard, not shaking, not performing anything. Min Jae lowered his hand. O stepped back. The gesture was small. The room registered it the way rooms register small things that carry enormous weight, quietly, completely, with a permanence that no amount of later management could undo. Seorin said something. Nia heard her voice, but not the words. It was directed at Min Jae, something low and urgent. He didn't respond to it. He was still looking at Nia with that expression she couldn't name and didn't need to. "The Alliance review will proceed through independent channels," Do-hyun said. He addressed the room, not theatrically, just clearly, in the tone of a man making a professional statement. "Every party with exposure through the Kong Group's pending agreements will have access to full documentation by end of business tomorrow. Ms. Okoye's attorneys and my organization's legal team are coordinating to ensure no legitimate partner sustains unrecovered losses." He was giving the room something to hold on to, something that was not the wreckage of a man's authority, but a path through it. She had not asked him to do that. He had understood it was needed. Tanaka said something to Suzuki in Japanese. She caught 2 words. She spoke enough Japanese to know the words, reliable and structure. They were talking about her. Nia looked at Min Jae one more time. She did it because she needed to. Not for the room, not for anyone watching, for herself. She needed to look at this man who had been the central fact of her adult life for 22 years and understand what she was seeing now that she hadn't been able to see before. She saw it. A man who had been standing on something he had not built and had believed so completely in his own right to stand there that he had never thought to look down. She turned away from him. The room shifted around her like water. People moved, conversations resumed. The ambient noise of 200 people resumed its particular texture. But the texture was different now. The room had been rearranged by what it had witnessed, and rearranged rooms do not go back. Do-hyun walked beside her toward the far end of the ballroom. Araez was there. She had come up to the floor while the confrontation was happening and was now standing near the windows with a glass of champagne. She wasn't drinking, watching everything. Nia reached her. Araez looked at her face. "Done?" she said. "Not yet," Nia said. Because across the room, Seorin had separated from Min-jae and was moving toward the exit with the specific purpose of someone who had just made a decision. And the look on her face, not the performance, not the manufactured confidence from that night in the foyer, was something Nia hadn't expected. It was the look of a woman who had something to say and had just decided the cost of not saying it was higher than the cost of saying it. And before she reached the exit, she stopped. She turned. She looked across the ballroom at Nia with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite a plea, but was something in between, something human and unperformed. And then she started walking toward her instead. Seorin walked like someone who had rehearsed stopping and decided against it at the last second. There was no elegance in it. Her heels were wrong for the pace she was keeping, and she nearly caught one on the edge of the ballroom carpet. And she didn't look like a woman making a grand gesture. She looked like a woman who had run out of reasons not to do a hard thing and was doing it before she could find new reasons. Nia watched her come. She didn't move toward her or away. She stood where she was, near the windows, with Adaeze at her left and Do-hyun 3 feet to her right, and she watched Yoon Seorin cross the ballroom floor with the expression of someone arriving at a reckoning they had been circling for a long time. Seorin stopped 4 feet away, close enough to talk quietly, far enough that it wasn't intimate. She was younger up close than she'd seemed in the foyer that night. Not young, late 20s was right. But the performance had dropped away completely, and what was underneath it was a face that had been through something in the past 72 hours and hadn't slept much either. Her eyes were dry. That was the first thing Nia noticed. Whatever was happening in Seorin's chest, she was not going to cry about it here, which Nia found she respected in a way she hadn't expected to. "I owe you something," Seorin said. Her voice was steady, a little hoarse. Nia waited. "I knew about the divorce papers before that night." Seorin looked at her directly. Not performing contrition. She wasn't built for performed contrition. Nia could see that. It wasn't in her architecture. She was just stating a fact and bearing the weight of it. "He told me 3 weeks before. He said it was already decided, that you two had an understanding." "We didn't have an understanding," Nia said. "I know that now." Seorin's jaw tightened slightly. "I think I knew it then too. I just didn't ask the question out loud." A pause. "He told me the suite, your mother's rooms. He said they'd been empty for 2 years. He said you'd been wanting to convert them into a guest space and just hadn't gotten around to it." Nia felt something move through her. Not rage. Something quieter and more corrosive. The specific feeling of discovering that a cruelty you'd thought was spontaneous had actually been deliberate, planned, packaged, made palatable for the person delivering it. "She died 14 months ago," Nia said. Seorin closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. "I didn't know," she said. "I'm not asking you to believe that, but I didn't know." "I believe you," Nia said. And she did. Not because she was generous, but because she understood, looking at this woman, that Min-jae had curated what Seorin knew as carefully as he curated everything else, had kept her in a version of events that made him the reasonable party and Nia the inconvenient obstacle, had done to her, in a different register, exactly what he'd done to the lawyers and the alliance partners and the investment groups, given her information shaped to produce a specific behavior, and trusted that she wouldn't look behind it. Seorin exhaled. It was not quite relief. There was no relief available for what she was doing right now, Nia thought, and Seorin seemed to know that. It was more like the exhale of someone who has been holding something in a grip that was hurting them and has finally loosened it, knowing the thing may fall. "The Singapore account," Seorin said. "I need to tell you something about the Singapore account." Nia went very still. "I knew money was being moved into a company under my name," Seorin said. "He told me it was a business arrangement, a security measure. He said it was normal for someone in his position to distribute assets across multiple entities. He said..." She stopped. "He said a lot of things." "Did you ask questions?" Nia said. "Not enough." Seorin's voice was flat with self-knowledge. "I didn't ask enough questions. I saw numbers moving into an account that had my name on it, and I told myself it was what he said it was, and I didn't push. She met Nia's eyes. But I have documentation. Every transfer notification, every account statement, everything he sent me or had sent to me regarding that account. I have it on my phone and in my email. I kept it because... She paused. I think I kept it because some part of me knew that you keep documentation when something feels wrong. Areiz made a sound beside Nia. Not a word. Just the small involuntary sound of a person hearing something they hadn't expected. You'll give that to my attorney, Nia said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Seorin said. That's why I turned around. Nia looked at her for a long moment. The ballroom noise moved around them. It had resumed, conversations and clinking glasses, and the performance of normalcy that people maintain even when the ground beneath an event has fundamentally shifted, because the alternative is standing in silence, acknowledging that everything has changed, and most people would rather not do that until they absolutely have to. Why now? Nia said. You've had 72 hours. Seorin glanced, just briefly, across the room toward where Min-jae was standing. He was talking to someone. She couldn't see who from this angle, and she didn't try to. Then Seorin looked back. Because I watched you walk into this room, she said, and I watched you stand in front of him and say things that were true. And I watched him try to reach for you and get stopped, and I thought... She stopped, tried again. I thought, she has been telling the truth the entire time, from the beginning, and I've been on the wrong side of it. A pause. I don't have a lot of things I can say in my own defense right now, but I can do this. Nia took out her phone. She pulled up Cho's contact and handed the phone to Seo Rin. Call her. Tell her you're coming tonight with documentation. She'll meet you at her office. Seo Rin took the phone. Her handle was not steady. She looked at the contact information, then back at Nia. There was something in her face that wanted to be a full apology, a reckoning, a conversation about what had happened and what it had cost and who bore what portion of the responsibility. Nia could see it. She also knew they didn't have the room for it here, and possibly didn't have the relationship for it at all, and that what Seorin was offering was not absolution-seeking but something more useful and harder. Evidence. Go, Nia said. Not unkindly. Seorin nodded. She made the call. Nia heard Cho's assistant pick up, heard Seorin say her name and that she had documentation relevant to the Kong case and needed to come tonight. She handed the phone back. She looked at Nia one more time with an expression that had no performance left in it whatsoever. Just a woman standing in the specific rubble of the choices she'd made and understanding clearly what each piece was. Then she left. Nia watched her go. She watched her cross the ballroom floor, watched her collect a small bag from the coat check, watched her walk through the hotel doors without looking back. Huh, Areiz said. Yeah, Nia said. Do-hyun was beside her. What did she give you? Documentation of every transfer into the Seo Rim international account. From her end. Her records. Nia paused. Combined with the authorization signatures on Min-jae's end, it closes the chain completely. There's no gap left for an alternative interpretation. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then, his case against you just became significantly harder to build. Yes. She looked across the room at Min-jae. He was watching the door Seorin had walked through. He hadn't seen the conversation. He'd been too far away, the ballroom was too loud, and he'd been managing his own deteriorating situation on the other side of the room. But he'd seen Seorin leave. She watched him understand from the particular way she'd left. Purposeful, not distressed, not looking for him, that something had happened that he hadn't controlled. He turned and found Nia's eyes across the room. The distance between them was 30 feet and 200 witnesses, and 9 years, and everything that had been said tonight, and everything that had preceded it. He looked at her with the expression she still couldn't name, the one that had appeared in the conference room and reappeared on the ballroom floor, the one that was not quite regret and not quite recognition, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, then she turned away. The reception began to empty out over the following hour. Not dramatically. People didn't flee, they simply concluded that the event had reached its natural end and found reasons to leave. Investment partners who needed early flights. Political contacts with morning schedules. The men in expensive suits who didn't speak, and who Nia noted were among the first to go, which told her the syndicate's internal calculus was already shifting, already moving toward the next configuration of power without waiting for Min Jae to authorize the transition. Baek Sung-il found her near the elevator bank at 7:45. He looked the way he'd looked in the cafe, a large man working hard to carry something that was heavier than he'd expected. He had clearly not attended the reception as a guest. He was in a different suit than the night before, which meant he'd gone home at some point, which meant he'd had hours to decide whether to come back. He had come back. The lieutenants met this afternoon, he said. He spoke quietly, in Korean, which she answered in kind. Her Korean was fluent, had been for years, another thing Min Jae had never fully registered. 7 of the 12, emergency session. He paused. They voted to suspend Min Jae's operational authority pending the outcome of the financial review. Nia absorbed that. He knows. His lawyer told him an hour ago. Beck glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where Min Jae was now standing with only 2 people, both of them, Nia recognized, personal loyalists rather than operational ones. Men who would stay out of personal feeling rather than practical calculation. He has his financial interest in the syndicate. He won't go without resources, but the organization, Beck stopped. The organization will rebuild under different management. Under you, she said. He looked at her. Partially. There will need to be a restructuring, legitimate side especially. He paused. We're going to need people who understand the legitimate architecture, the trust-held assets, the compliance frameworks, the international partnerships, people who know how it was built. She understood what he was asking. That's not a conversation for tonight, she said. No, he agreed, but it will need to be had. He left. She stood near the elevator bank for a moment alone. Just a moment. Ariez was 10 feet away, talking to one of Do-hyun's associates, and Do-hyun himself was with Suzuki, doing the quiet, essential work of reassurance that would determine whether the Japanese investment relationship survived this. And she breathed, just breathed. The air in the Walker Hill was hotel air, climate-controlled and generic, and it was the finest thing she had inhaled in days. Min Jae found her there. She heard him before she saw him, or not heard him exactly, felt him, the particular weight of his presence that she had been calibrated to register at a distance for 22 years. She turned before he spoke. He looked diminished. Not physically. He was still Min Jae Kang, still the physical fact of him, the broad shoulders and the careful posture and the face that had commanded rooms for 2 decades. But something behind his eyes had gone out, or was going out. The slow extinguishing of something that had powered the whole performance for so long that neither of them had fully understood it was a performance until tonight. I need to talk to you, he said. You have lawyers for that now, she said. Not about legal things. He paused. His voice had lost the tight control of earlier in the evening. What was left was something rawer, less managed. She didn't think he was fully aware of how different he sounded. About... He stopped. Tried again. I need to ask you something. She waited. The 9 years, he said. All of it. The work you did. The relationships you built. The things you managed that I didn't... He stopped again. He was not a man who struggled with words. He was struggling with words. Did you stay because of the trust? Was it always... He couldn't finish it. She understood the question. He was asking whether their marriage had been a long strategy, whether she had been executing a plan for 9 years while he believed she was simply present, whether everything she'd said and built and managed had been the architecture of an exit. She looked at him. She took her time with the answer because he had asked something real, and he deserved a real answer, and because she wanted to know it herself, wanted to hear what she said when she said it without preparation. No, she said. I stayed because I believed in you. For a long time I believed in the version of you that existed in the first 2 years, before the empire got large enough that you stopped needing to be the person I knew. She paused. I stayed too long. That's my accounting error, not a strategy. She held his gaze. The trust was my father's protection for me. It was never a trap. You walked into it on your own. He looked at her. The ballroom noise was very distant now. Most of the guests had filtered out. The staff was beginning the quiet work of clearing tables. The light had changed, the reception lighting giving way to the ordinary illumination of a room being put back to rights. I made you invisible, he said. It was the most accurate thing he had ever said about their marriage. She had not expected it. She felt it land in her chest with the specific weight of a true thing that has been waiting a long time to be said out loud. "Yes," she said. "And then I was angry when you weren't there." He said it like a man reading his own diagnosis for the first time. Not dramatic, just the flat, unflinching quality of someone who has run out of the energy required to avoid a truth. "When the Empire started showing the cracks, I looked for you, and you weren't in the place I'd put you, and I thought you had failed me." He paused. "You hadn't moved. I had." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the hotel Seoul was fully dark and fully lit at the same time, the city's permanent contradiction, and the Han River was somewhere out there in the blackness running its indifferent course. "Min Jae," she said quietly, "what do you want me to say?" He was quiet. Then, "Nothing. I don't think I'm asking for anything." He exhaled slowly. "I think I just needed you to know that I know. Whatever comes next with the lawyers and the review and the—" He gestured vaguely at the space where the evening had taken place. "All of it. I want you to know that I know what I did, and what I didn't do, and what I lost." She didn't fill the silence after that. There was nothing in her that wanted to be generous in a way that would make this easier for him, but there was also nothing that wanted to be cruel. She had made her accounting errors in this marriage, and he had made his, and the ledger between them was long and complicated and would take lawyers and courts and months of formal process to settle. None of that would be made better or worse by what she said in this hotel corridor at 8 in the evening with the cleanup crew working quietly around them. "Go home," she said finally. "Whatever home is now, go there." He looked at her one last time, then he nodded. He turned and walked toward the elevator bank. She watched his back. She watched the elevator doors open and close and take him away. She stood alone for 30 seconds. Then Adi's appeared at her elbow, and it was exactly like being 16 again, Adi's appearing at her elbow in the kitchen when something was hard and just standing there, not fixing it, just present. "Ready?" Adi said. "Almost," Nia said. The formal legal proceedings took 4 months. Cho Yeon-hee was in her element, thorough, strategic, and possessed of a particular relish for documentation that Nia found, as the weeks accumulated, genuinely comforting. Min Jae's outside counsel withdrew 12 days after the reception, citing irreconcilable conflicts with their ethical obligations upon reviewing the Singapore documentation. Han Jae-won's firm took reduced scope and advised settlement. The settlement negotiations were not gentle. Min Jae had resources and pride, and underneath the collapse of the reception night, a residual instinct toward combat that reasserted itself periodically through his new legal team's filings. There were 3 weeks in February when the proceedings became genuinely ugly. Motions and counter-motions, and a filing that attempted, briefly, to introduce the narrative about Nia's role in the legitimate subsidiary operations as evidence of her financial culpability. Cho had anticipated it. The counter-documentation was ready before the filing was fully entered. The attempt died in 3 days without ever gaining traction. Seorin's documentation proved decisive. Combined with the authorization chain Do Hyun's team had built, and Baek Sung-il's sworn testimony, the Singapore account fraud was attributed completely and unambiguously to Min Jae's authorization. No alternative narrative survived contact with the paper trail, his own signatures on every transfer, and his distinctive controlled slant. There was no version of events in which Nia had architected this. The record did not permit it. She thought about her father sometimes during those 4 months. Not constantly. She didn't have the luxury of constant. But in the margins of things, in the 30 seconds before sleep and the first minutes of morning, she thought about James Okoye sitting across from his 15-year-old daughter at a kitchen table in Chicago with a balance sheet between them. She thought about what he had known and what he had built and what he had trusted her to carry. She had not understood when she was 15 why he was teaching her to read a financial document with such specificity, such seriousness, as if her actual life might depend on it. She understood now. She thought he would have appreciated the irony that the thing he built to protect her had also, in the end, protected itself. The trust was intact. Every asset he had structured, every instrument he had drafted in the careful handwriting she'd read by lamplight in a serviced apartment 3 days into the worst week of her life, all of it held. The divorce was finalized in March. Every disputed asset was returned to the Okoye family trust per the court's determination. The Han River mansion, the East Wing, the land beneath both, all of it. The overseas holding companies, the shipping route agreements, the real estate portfolio. Everything her father had structured, everything she had managed and protected and grown during 9 years of marriage came back. She signed the final document in Cho's conference room on a Thursday morning with rain on the windows. Cho watched her sign and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. The syndicate restructured over those same 4 months. Baek Sung-il led the operational transition with a steadiness that Nia found, from the careful distance she maintained, genuinely professional. Min Jae retained his financial interest, reduced but not eliminated, enough to live on well, enough to ensure he did not spend the rest of his life in active opposition to the restructuring out of pure desperation. It was, Cho explained in the language of legal realism, better than the alternative. A man with nothing to lose was more dangerous than a man with reduced holdings and diminished authority. Nia understood. She didn't have to like it. He moved to Jeju Island in April. She didn't hear this from him directly. She heard it through Baek, who mentioned it the way one mentions logistical facts. Without weight, without commentary. She thought about it once. Once was enough. The East Wing she did not restore. Not immediately. She returned to the mansion in late March, 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and she walked through every room in the order she'd known them for 9 years. The study with the filing cabinet she'd brought from Chicago. The kitchen where she'd had most of the real conversations of her marriage, standing at the counter at odd hours when the house was quiet. The main hall with the antique console table and the bronze light fixtures she'd fought the architect about. All of it. She stood in the doorway of the East Wing for a long time. The suite her mother had lived in for 18 months. The rooms that had been the site of her mother's last comfortable season, all the days of sitting together in the afternoon light, all the conversations they'd had that Nia had replayed so many times since that they'd stopped feeling like memories and started feeling like a landscape she carried inside her. The rooms Min Jae had wanted to give away before the divorce papers were even opened. She didn't go in. Not that day. She stood in the doorway for what she needed to stand there for, and then she closed the door gently and walked back to the study. In May, she established the foundation. She didn't name it after her mother. Her mother had been a private woman who would have disliked the attention, but she funded the initial endowment from a portion of the returned assets with the particular deliberateness of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and why. The foundation's purpose was operational: legal resources, financial counseling, emergency housing, employment infrastructure for women exiting financially controlling relationships. Not counseling and sympathy, though those had their place. Practical architecture. The thing her father had understood that most people in crisis didn't have access to. The specific knowledge of how to read the documents in front of you and understand what they actually said. The East Wing became the foundation's headquarters in June. It took her the 3 months between March and June to be ready. She hired a small renovation team and she was present for every decision. The desk placement, the conference table, the small kitchen they put in off the hallway, the reading corner by the window that looked out over the garden where her mother had sometimes sat in the afternoons when she was strong enough. She didn't try to erase her mother from the rooms. She folded her into them differently, made the rooms into something her mother would have recognized as useful, which was the highest compliment her mother would have offered anything. The opening was a quiet event, 40 people. Cho was there. Baek came, which surprised her and then didn't. Young-hee, the analyst with the highlighter, who had turned out to be someone Nia had offered a position to on the foundation's financial oversight board. 3 of the foundation's first clients, women referred through legal channels, each at different stages of their own processes, each present not as symbols but as people who had work to do and had agreed to attend a small gathering in a house that had once meant something specific and now meant something different. Do-hyun was there. He stood near the window of the main sitting room, the one that looked out over the Han River, with a glass of water and the particular quality of presence that she had come to understand as simply characteristic of him, there without requiring the room to know he was there, attentive without performing attention. She found herself beside him at some point in the evening, both of them looking at the river, and it was the first time in months that she had stood near him without a legal crisis or a document between them, and she noticed, in the absence of those things, that the steadiness he produced in a room was not conditional on crisis. It was just him. The specific quality of a person who had decided, at some point, what they valued and had stopped performing the deciding. It's a good use of the space, he said. It's what my mother would have wanted. He looked at the river. She looked at the river. The evening light was doing something complicated with the water. The late spring light that Seoul did well, the particular quality of it in May, the way it made the city look almost tender. I owe you an observation, he said. She looked at him. Go ahead. When I first reviewed your documentation, the trust instruments, the subsidiary frameworks, the compliance structures, I thought, whoever built this understands how institutions actually hold together, not the surface architecture, the load-bearing parts. He paused. I spent 6 months assuming the person who built it was your father. He built the trust, she said. He built the foundation, Do-hyun said. You built everything on top of it. I understand that now. It's visible in how the structures talk to each other, the way the compliance frameworks reference the trust instruments, the way the international partnership agreements are structured to protect the trust's interests while appearing to serve the Kong groups. That's not James Okoye. That's you. He looked at her. I wanted you to know I see that. She was quiet for a moment. Why? She said. Why did you want me to know? He considered that. He was honest in his considerations. She'd noticed this consistently, the way he didn't reach for the comfortable answer. Because I think you spent 9 years being the most essential person in a structure that required you to be invisible, he said. And I thought it was worth saying clearly and without any other agenda that what you built was exceptional, not for what it won you in a legal proceeding, as a piece of work. He paused. It was exceptional work. She looked at the river. She felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not dramatically, not with the weight of a revelation, but the quiet subsidence of something that had been held in tension and had been allowed finally to release. Thank you, she said. She meant it the way she'd meant it outside the elevator that night in Mappo, which was not as courtesy but as acknowledgement. But this time there was more underneath it, more that she meant and did not say, because the evening was not the moment, and they were people who had learned, both of them in different ways, not to rush what didn't need rushing. He nodded. He understood what she didn't say, she thought. He was good at that. The guests began to leave around 9. She stood at the door of the East Wing and watched them go, said the things you say, received the warmth people offer at events like this with the particular grace of a woman who had learned over the past 6 months to receive things without immediately cataloging what they cost. Cho squeezed her hand at the door and said only, "Your father," and then left before Nia had to respond. Baek Sung-il shook her hand and said he'd be in touch about the Foundation's first formal partnership with the restructured Kang Group's legitimate arm, which was a conversation she had agreed to have and intended to have well. Young-hee left last of the formal guests, her highlighter tucked, as always, in her jacket pocket. Arias stayed. Of course she stayed. She was sitting in the reading corner by the window when the last guest left and the room settled into quiet, and she had taken off her shoes and pulled her feet up in the chair in the way she'd sat since childhood, and she looked at Nia across the room with the look she'd been looking at her with for 41 years. Nia crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her, just the two of them. The river outside and the city light and the room her mother had lived in, quieter now and different, but still recognizably itself, the bones of it unchanged by what had been done to the surface. "How are you actually?" Arias said. Nia thought about it. Not the performance of thinking, but actual consideration. Sitting with the question, the way you sit with something you're not in a hurry to simplify. Tired, she said, specifically and genuinely tired in a way that I think will last a while. That's fair? Also, she paused, also more myself than I've been in a long time, which is a strange thing to feel in a house that caused me most of the damage of the past 9 years. But here, Arias was quiet. She was good at quiet, her sister. She'd learned it from their father, who had understood that the best thing you could do for a person who was thinking was not interrupt the thinking. He said I was invisible, Nia said. Adaisi looked at her. At the reception. At the end, when everyone had gone, he said he made me invisible. She paused. It was the most honest thing he said in 22 years of knowing him. I keep thinking about that it took losing everything for him to say the one true thing. People are like that, Arias said. They know what's true. They just find it expensive to say. I knew too, Nia said. I knew I was disappearing, and I let it happen because the alternative was a confrontation I wasn't ready to have. She looked at her hands. The hands that had been shaking in the foyer and on the phone with Do Hyun and through 3 days of legal preparation and had steadied, finally, somewhere in a hotel ballroom in front of 200 witnesses. I'm not going to do that again. No, Arias said simply. You're not. They sat together in the room that had been their mother's room and was now something else, something forward-facing and purposeful. And the river ran its course outside the window, and the city went on being itself, relentless and luminous and indifferent in all the ways that cities are and that people need them to be, because it means the world doesn't stop for private griefs and private victories. It just keeps going, and you can keep going inside it. Nia thought about the balance sheet, the one her father had set in front of her when she was 15. She thought about how she had looked at it then. The columns of numbers, the relationships between assets and liabilities, the fundamental logic of it. And how she had thought, sitting at that kitchen table in Chicago, this is just a way of keeping track. This is just a record of what things are worth and what they cost and what you have left. She understood now what her father had been teaching her, and it was not about finance. It was about the willingness to look at a ledger clearly, including the one inside yourself. The willingness to read what it actually said instead of the version you needed it to say. The willingness to do the accounting on your own life with the same precision and the same honesty you'd bring to any document that mattered. She had done that accounting now. She had done it in a study in the middle of the night, and in a cafe on a Tuesday, and in a Gangnam conference room, and in a hotel ballroom, and in a corridor where the man she'd known for 22 years had said her name the way you say a word when you're trying to remember the weight of it. The ledger was clear. The balance was not what she'd expected when she started. The losses were different, and the assets were different, and some of what she'd thought was loss turned out to be inventory. She'd been holding without knowing it. Some of what she'd thought was asset had always been liability. That was how accounting worked when you finally did it honestly. Things rearranged themselves into their actual values. She was not the Mafia Boss's wife. She had not been for a long time, if she was being precise. She was Nia Okoye, whose father had sat across from her at a kitchen table and taught her that power was not what people pointed at from the outside. It was what you could actually prove when you opened the right drawer. She had opened the drawer. She was still here. Arias fell asleep in the reading chair around 10:30, which was the most Arias thing she could have done, and which made Naya, looking at her sleeping sister with her feet tucked up like a child, feel something she didn't try to name because names made things smaller. She covered her with the blanket from the back of the chair. Her mother's blanket, soft and slightly faded, the one that had lived in this room. And she went to the window and stood there looking at the Han River. The river was the same river it had always been from this window, dark and moving and lit from the city on both banks, carrying its cargo of light and reflection without comment. She had looked at it on the night this started and thought it had only ever belonged to her. She still believed that. She believed it more precisely now. Not the romantic version, not the version where the river was a symbol of anything, just the simple fact of it. She had been here before all of this. She would be here after. The view from this window was hers because she was standing at it, and because no one could take a view. She turned off the light. She left Adias sleeping. She walked through the East Wing corridor and paused at the door of the main suite, her mother's suite, and put her hand flat against the door for a moment. Just a moment. The wood was solid under her palm, old and sound and not going anywhere. She walked to the study. She sat down at the desk. She opened her laptop. There were 46 unread emails, foundation inquiries, legal follow-ups, a message from Young-hee about the first client intake protocol, 2 from Do-hyun's office about the partnership framework timeline. She would answer them in the morning. She would answer all of them, carefully and completely, because they were the work, and the work was the point. The work was what the whole structure had been pointing toward without either her father or herself fully knowing it. She closed the laptop. She put her hand in her cardigan pocket. The pen was there. She had forgotten she had it on her. She took it out and looked at it. A cheap pen, the kind she'd always kept, the habit she'd inherited from years of wanting to write things down before they disappeared. She set it on the desk. She looked out at the river. She breathed.